Thank you so much, Professor Hillmann, and for this very, very insightful and interesting talk. And I am sure that we have a question and comments. The first person who already raised her hand and has a question is Mahdiye. Mahdiye, would you please ask your question?
Hello, and thank you. So first, let me appreciate Professor Hillmann's extremely inspiring and insightful talk. My question is, I love formalism, and as an academic who is also an artist, I really, truly value that aesthetic pleasure that you were talking about. As a master's student, I had the opportunity to go through the intersection of philosophy, literature, the aesthetics of poetry, formalism, all these, technical devices that expresses the poets clearly. But as I went on in my academic career, I saw that like literature now is at the service of two things, mostly historicity and politics. So I was wondering, what advice do you have for young academics like me who love formalism, who love to talk about this aesthetic pleasure and these literally devices, but on the other hand, they also need to talk about post-colonialism, post-colonialism, all these Orientalism, all these theories that academy is interested in today. So I was wondering if you have perhaps thought of an intersection that we could find to incorporate formalism within those theories and structures.
When you're a guest at somebody's house, you have to eat the food you're served. If you don't like the food they're serving, you don't go to that house. I avoid biology unless I'm at a physician's office. And then I'm just interested in knowing how we can fix something if it's not working right. That is, as an academic, you have a right to focus exclusively on what you're interested in and participate in as many conversations in other fields on the job as you want to. I find at parties, I end up talking about automobiles to people who like automobiles, and I couldn't care less about automobiles. And when I go to a shop, I have them lift up the hood and I look in too. I can tell if it's clean or dirty, not much else. I have no interest in Orientalism as a field. I learned Persian not knowing that Orientalism existed. I didn't know who Edward Brown was when I studied Hafez on my own in Mashhad, teaching myself to read and Hafez, Ferdowsi, what have you. I just learned the stuff in the context of being interested in poetry. This other stuff came on later, and I didn't have much interest in it. I'm more interested in the history of my family than I'm in the history of the United States. I failed European history in college, and I can give you dynasty by dynasty and king by king the history of Iran. I don't know how the hell that happened. Well, maybe it's because everybody I talked to knew something about history, and it just kind of stayed. And I found it was kind of interesting. I wouldn't call it a quandary. I would just call it your decision to be small c Catholic in your interests or not. I don't think the two realms of reading poetry are politics and history. In fact, half of the poems of the two poems in the New Yorker every week aren't political. Poetry is big business in the United States. It's not big business in American culture. Every university's got poets in residence. Every bookstore's got a lot of poetry collections. There are all kinds of resources, but you've got to gravitate toward people who are similar in orientation. For me, they're called Iranians. Iranians are interested in poetry. And in fact, when you dig deep into people who have actually read stuff and know what's going on and stuff, they're not political. They're not interested in history. They are more interested in the depths of what they think are deep ideas than things that are superficial. But at the same time, they don't want to read the poem to you. They want you to read the poem to them so they hear it. Because lyric poetry for Iranians in the main still means the sounds that go on. So even if they're looking for bah, 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 oh, me, they want to hear it. And Rumi is interesting because he does a drum solo in half of his ghazals. He does something which is just what it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
And if there's meaning in it, that's fine. But we don't have to, you just have to be able to learn to twirl around without losing your equilibrium or finding a new equilibrium, so to speak. I appreciate where you're coming from. After all, this engagé business, once it got in 1960s, they complained. In the 1930s, they complained about Hemingway not being engagé. So I said, what the hell? And so he did For Whom the Bell Tolls. His weakest novel, but we all love it because there's a cause in it, makes a movie, and that sort of thing. In Iran, it was the same way in the 1960s. You could get by being aesthete. That is, we had to invent for Nima Yushij when he's talking about he can't find his son in Dar Kenar Rudhone. He's talking about people not understanding his poetry. And so he feels like the sun is not shining in his world, although the turtle is just lying there having a great time. Forugh Farrokhzad, feminist appreciation of Farrokhzad is on target. It's not poetic appreciation, something else, maybe more important. So the people who say Farrokhzad is a great poet because she has the following feminist thesis in a particular poem, they're talking about something else. Remember, of the three most famous shorter feminist poems of hers, Allahé, Surud Peykar, and Bekhoharam, she only let Allahé get published. She didn't publish the other two because she realized they were doing something else besides what she was, what was her business, which is poetry. And Allahé makes it because she's not in it and she's not telling anybody what to do. She's just describing one woman's experience of seeing this shiny object, Allahé Davaj, that other people are saying, oh, it's a symbol, it's a secret to life, the secret to happiness. And she ends up finding, no, it's an emblem of Bardagi, of Bandagi, even though it shines brightly.
Thank you very much. I found some promising points in your answer. Thank you.
Just don't go to any American
thank you. The next question.
Let me say one other thing. Just don't go to American parties without a lot of Iranians and somebody asks you what you do and you say, I write things about poetry. Conversations will slow down if you do that. What poetry do you write things about? Persian. That'll slow things down. Make certain there's some Iranians around.
Thank you.
I'm glad this is being recorded.
Okay, the next question, Dr. Poone Shabani. Could you please unmute yourself?
How are you?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this wonderful, interesting talk. In every slide that you showed, I could find a good research project to do. So it was very thought-provoking and very interesting. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. My question is about Forugh and her contemporaries, and which contemporary of hers do you think had the most influence of her, and vice versa? And then while you were answering the other question, I also wanted to ask you which translation of Forugh do you recommend to somebody who is who doesn't know that much about Forugh? Thank you. Oh, and happy Nowruz to everybody.
Same to you. In the case of translations, the Banani Kessler translation attempts in part to duplicate formal aspects of Persian originals. For example, the Mir-Djalali poem, which is in Masnavi form, and the Ghazal poem, or maybe the Ghazal poem is Mir-Djalali. Anyway, there's one Mir-Djalali, there's one Ghazal poem, one Masnavi poem. He makes an effort. Kessler's the poet. Amin Banani was helping him, giving the background and context and what have you. The problem occurs specifically in formalist terms. That is, if I, in Persian, have 5 D sounds in a particular line, and the line ends with a D in the rhyme, I've pulled things together in such a way and created a new emphasis. What am I going to do in English? If I have 3 words that are synonyms in Persian, and they also have, let's say they also have the same Arabic root system, they also have some family resemblance, how am I going to find 3 words for a family resemblance to the same effects? So the good translations will give us the meaning. The good translation will give us the attitude of the speaker, the tone of the text. But I'm not so certain they're going to give us poetry or the poetry that was in the original. And as you know, a couple of the translations have opted for free verse. Even lunches aren't free. And Iran doesn't have anything we call free verse in general. Shamlu kind of on the side here among the majors. When what people call free verse happens in Forugh Farrokhzad, she still follows a nemaic version of classical aruz patterns, which means you can scan the rhythm. Free verse means you can't scan the rhythm. So if you opt for free verse to do Farrokhzad, even Tanha Sadaskami Monad or Panjare, later poems which are all over the place in terms of traditional form, brilliant poems, but all over the place. If you lose scannable rhythm, what are you going to substitute that produces the effect of scannable rhythm? You got to do something in place of rhyme, something in place of alliteration, consonance, assonance, what they're now calling jaduye mujawarat, and rhythm. Dick Davis has 5 pages on Farrokhzad in his volume on women's poetry and Iranian women's poetry in English. He has 4 other women poets have more pages than Farrokhzad. If this were a sport, I would ask for instant replay. That is, how do you get 5 pages on Farrokhzad and 9 or 10 on Parveen Tasami in poetry terms, not in terms of inspirational, didactic, or contextualized statements about things. And he has a couple of poems. When he says he's doing a poem, Dick Davis does a poem. The verse parts of the Shahnameh, his prosometric translation of the Shahnameh, they're poems, they're good. But every one I read of the poems where he is close to the text and has his English rhythms, his iambic rhythm, it still is missing something. And I think it's missing something formal that you really can't replicate. That is, poetry is not an international language like painting and music can be for people who know what's going on. You can know what's going on in poetry, but if you only know the target language and not the original language, they say that English translations of French poetry and French translations of English poetry are pretty good. Why? Because the 2 people doing the translations know both French and English. It's kind of, that is, they've got 2 sets of parietal aesthetic information starting out, whereas we are all at a disadvantage from Persian to English, doesn't matter which one it is. If we're not native to both or poets in both, there's going to be something missing. And your first question, influence. Farrokhzad was influenced by mid-century quatrain sequence poetry. Interesting stuff by Nadirpur, Moshiri, who was the other guy with Moshiri? who did The Woman Leaves Him. Moshiri does, no, Moshiri is that, yeah, Kuche, Moshiri and Tavalali. So she got that inspiration. What she realized at some point was, I'm saying all the things I want to say, but the sounds coming out of my mouth are not the way I want to say them. She didn't rebel. She just found her voice. She found the extra octave or whatever it is that would be parallel and went with it. And so that happens. 42 of 44 poems in Asyid are quatrain sequence. Only 3 or 4 poems in Divar are not quatrain sequence. No quatrain sequence maybe in Essian, and then we get to Tavalodiga. In terms of rhythm, I guess we'd say she owes most to 2 things. How many 13-year-old, 14-year-olds do you know who have ingested the Aruz system? I still haven't ingested it. I still think that most Persian poems have an accentual pattern as well as a quantitative pattern. I hear that before I hear the quantitative pattern. Here she was 13 or 14 years of age during her ghazal period, she called it, where she knew how to draw. The Picasso in the first 2 rooms in his museum, she could draw. She knew how to put the words together without thinking about them so they'd come out in the right rhythm. And then she moved on to see what Nima had done a little bit earlier and got some ideas from him. But I don't find imitation anywhere. How could she? That is, the minute she opened her mouth and said, I, the remaining words in the sentence were like no other words any of these other characters could produce, because she was a girl, a teenager, young married, unhappy married, divorced, involved with men. She was a woman. So she couldn't even string sentences together that would fit the pattern. So it'd be the quatrain sequence crowd. It was big business then. And then Nima in terms of rhythm. And I'm not saying that she does better quatrain sequence poems than some by Moshiri or Tavalali or Nadirpur especially, but she was doing stuff that was different. In that poem, Halghe, it's a quatrain sequence poem, not on paper, but if you go back and take a look at it, I think it's the 3rd stanza when she talks about years passing. That is, the young bride has heard all this stuff about what the Halghe is. She removes that line from the quatrain and makes it a separate line with its own stanza. So we've got 4, 3, 1, 4, 4. Salha gozesht. It's worth 4 lines because years passed, whereas the first couple of stanzas are just a moment, and the last 2 is another moment. So she understood that the form was supposed to serve something else rather than everything serving the form.
Okay, Professor Tawakkoli.
Yes, I did. Ustad Hillmann, thank you very much for this really thoughtful and inspiring presentation. If you recall, we had this conversation that I had gone through the earliest editions of Forugh Farrokhzad's published poems in newspapers and journals. And then I noticed that in published book edition, there has been some changes, some of them meaningful changes. For example, in Abtani, where she originally had Dasthay Mahv Khiyali, then in the published book edition, is changed to Dasthay Narm Bulurin. One can understand that an author can change and ideas change, but I thought the original Dasthay Mahv Khiyalin was much more forward and clear than maybe poetically more correct or approved than Dasthay Narm Bulurin. And there are a lot of other examples of it, that if one looks at the first journal edition of a poem, there are instances of really significant shifts that unfortunately in the literary history of Iranian modern literature, no one has really paid attention to those. People usually go to the first book edition and use that rather than trace the changes and shifts. And I'm wondering, what do you make of the change and shift from the journal edition of a poem to the first book edition, and what could it reveal to a scholar of Persian literature or a scholar of literature in general?
Bulurin works well with metaphors associated with the personification of the spring, because water can seem crystalline.
Yeah. But dastgah‌های محو و خیالی works really well too.
Khiyali, dastgah‌های khiyali,
Yeah.
that's spelling, that's not showing. To quote NCIS, rule number 43 is you show rather than tell whenever you can. Bulurin is showing.
I think it's Bulurin, محو خیالی.
What is in a lyric poem, what does khiyali mean?
Means your imaginary hands. This is the poem Abtani, where she's sitting there and the water goes through her body, and she's describing that sensual experience.
But why khiyali? Do we know it's khiyali?
No, but what I mean is that, what do you make of the actual shift from dastgah‌های محو و خیالی to dastgah‌های نرم و بلوری? I know both of them make sense.
The most famous 19th century American poem is probably Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. If you want to read it, read the 1891 version. He changed it as history changed. In the first edition, the Civil War wasn't in it. Slaves weren't free. Which is what he left is what we've got. How about the most famous example of a non-translation assumed to be a translation, Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat or Khayyam, where the first edition, he had two good reasons for doing a second edition. The first edition didn't sell. It was remaindered. He may have bought them all up so he wouldn't lose its reputation. And the second was, he thought more about it. And the fourth and fifth editions, fifth being having changes made, I think, after he died, but didn't get to see them in print. And so all of us in the practical literary critical business use the fifth edition.
But why not?
How about Great Expectations by Dickens? Doesn't he have two endings to Great Expectations? One for the newspapers. They wanted something with Stella to turn out all right, or however it was supposed to end, and one for the book. That is, how about Hafez's Divan? We only have a few ghazals we now know in one manuscript that Ahmad Sadri has published that was written down in his own lifetime. So when I, as a practical literary critic, look at a ghazal by Hafez and want to talk about it to others, I say, I'm using the Khanladi edition. I'm using the Ghazvini Khani edition. I couldn't care less what was in the other editions as a practical literary critic, because I can only do one text at a time. How about Shahnameh? The Shahnameh most of you have grown up with, at least the people I've run into, think that when Rustam came to Samangan that night, when Tahmineh propositioned him, and he was questioning whether he should have her spend the night, and she said, by the way, I'll find your horse for you. He said, okay. And she spent the night. Before she spent the night, in most popular editions, they call a Zoroastrian, there not being any Zoroastrians at this time, but anyway, they call a Zoroastrian priest who performs a marriage ceremony. So we're all comfortable with this one night stand not being a one night stand from our anachronistic chronology. So what you raise are there are even more serious questions than just a noske badal. Just
no, but see, you're assuming that there is one singular authoritative.
No. I'm saying there's one Khan Lari, and that's in front of me. There's one Ghazali that's in front of me. When I'm writing a longish article on Hafiz right now, and I choose Khan Lari when I want to, and I choose Ghazvini when I want to. They're both legitimate, not authentic. They're both legitimate texts.
But my question is, in a sense, is that we have authoritative Forugh edition, Roshan Fikr journal. We also have authoritative Forugh edition, the published book. What do you make of the differences? And how
they're not both authoritative editions. You can choose either one you want, but you'd best choose the one that Farrokhzad approved last. That is, she published something in a magazine, and somebody calls from Shiraz, say, hey, Farroukh, you did this in line 3. You introduced a secte in the rhythm. If you had done that, you'd have gotten rid of the secte. And so she does what? She changes it before she does the second printing of Asir. That's the Asir that we should follow. But if you want to follow the other one, remember, you're talking about two different fields. Textual criticism is not literary criticism. It's not practical literary criticism. It's not theoretical literary criticism. It's a distinct field.
But historical literary criticism. So when you focus on the historicity about poems.
Your questions have, my dear colleague, your questions have periods at the end of them instead of question marks.
All right.
That's fine. So do mine. Historical literary criticism, okay. I'm talking about practical literary criticism. Aesthetic literary criticism. I mean, Ferdowsi, that is, we're never going to get Ferdowsi's Ferdowsi, but we're getting authentic Iranian Ferdowsis, every performance of Ferdowsi. Ahmad Sadri's Ferdowsi ends with what story? Has anybody read it? Famous new translation with famous new miniature paintings, came out 3 or 4 years ago. Anybody read it? With the death of Rostam. And he presents it as a complete Shahnameh. Did he have a right to do that? Why not? We know that there's more than half of it still left. But he decided that the tragedy in Iran was the death of Sohrab, the death of Rostam. For me, the tragedy was the death of Sohrab, but anyway, for him, it's the death of Rostam. So people read it. Do they get a full appreciation? In his terms, they do. Did Ferdowsi write a glowing plays of Sultan Mahmud at the beginning? Does anybody read that? Does anybody read the part of the introduction which praises 12-verse Shiite Islam, which, by the way, is the state religion of the country of Iran right now? We can ignore it. Mainly people who are literary critics who do what you're suggesting is they want to find out how the poet's mind worked. And usually they don't worry themselves so much with second or third editions. They'd like to see the handwritten text that the poet handed over to the publisher and to see what all the changes that the poet went through. The University of Texas has a Harry Ransom Center, HRC Center, where they gobble up the papers of poets to be able to study this process. That is, did Keats on his Nightingale Ode, what kinds of stages did he go through till he got to what he submitted to the publisher? And that gives us, apparently, ideas about how poets' minds work in the creative process.
Thank you so much. It was a very, very interesting discussion. I am so sorry we do not accept any other question answer. We do not want to exhaust Professor Hillmann. It's 5:45 in Toronto. So we just say thank you for all audiences, and thank you again, Professor Hillmann, and happy Nowruz. Eid Nowruz bar hame mubarak bad, و I hope that you enjoy the weekend. Okay.
Thank you. Same to you all.
Thank you, Professor Hillmann, and happy Nowruz to everyone.